Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hello and welcome to the ISO Show. Well, today's podcast is an interview with Derek Hall Mba. Now, Derek's been a consultant with Blackmores for over a decade now, and he brings a wealth of knowledge and experience on ISO standards. We're really fortunate to have him. So I thought it was about time that we got him onto the ISO Show so that he can share a bit about his knowledge and experience and views on sustainability and environmental management, and introduce him to you, of course, because there are a number of other podcasts that we're going to be doing with Derek based on him sharing hints and tips on sustainability management. So the next two episodes are actually going to be on implementing ISO 14001. But we will have future episodes over the coming year on other topics that Derek's an expert on, like environmental life cycle and all sorts of other interesting things that businesses can potentially apply within their organisation to improve efficiency, reduce their environmental footprint, and just to operate better businesses at the end of the day. So, without further ado, hello Derek.
Hello Mel.
Great, thanks very much for joining us today, Derek.
My pleasure.
So, before we begin, could you share something that not many people might know about you?
Well, there's a couple of things. One of them is that in my spare time I do karate. I'm a black belt or shodan in karate, and very interesting subject area because it's more about looking at, as you might expect, a physical view on human nature, let's say, as opposed to just my day job where I'm looking at standards, etc.
So how long have you been doing karate for then?
For over 12 years now.
Okay, brilliant. Oh, so getting to a black belt in that period of time was pretty impressive then.
It's been a lot of hard work, actually. So I started off knowing nothing. Now that I'm a black belt, I still know nothing. I'm still learning.
Does that mean you get more or less injuries then?
I think because I'm training all the time, it's less injuries. Yeah, I think if you don't train so much, you're more likely to be injured. But we're in a club that is basically a non-contact club.
Okay.
So we're penalised actually for contact.
Right. Okay, so I know that you bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise to our clients here at Blackmores, but could you just share with our listeners where it all began? How did you get into ISO standards and environmental management? Where did it all begin, Derek?
Probably started in the early 90s, in fact it did, if I remember rightly, around 92. My commercial director at the time put me on a course, an auditing course, for what was BS 5750. I must admit, I didn't particularly enjoy it. But as time evolved, I realised the benefits of environmental auditing and in fact the benefits of putting in management systems within industry, and certainly in our industry, which at the time was printing, screen printing, there are a lot of environmental impacts.
Can I just interrupt you there, Derek? So BS 5750, for those listeners that haven't heard of it, was the original quality standard, which
Correct.
Then became ISO 9001.
Yeah.
But interestingly, how you mentioned environmental management in the early 90s as well. So that would have been fairly new to businesses.
Yeah. Well, at that time, we put in also BS 7750, which was the precursor for ISO 14001. So we run sort of dual systems, and more we realise that you can't just run, certainly in print, you can't just run a quality system. You need to look at environmental impacts, and you need to look at a variety of other methods.
And I think at the time that would have been ahead of many of your competitors, I would have thought. Is that the case?
Yeah, that's certainly correct. We were asked at the time by our key clients, which were advertising agencies, what we were doing about quality, what we were doing about environment. as it evolved over the years, what our corporate social responsibility was.
So I guess with that being fairly new to you at the time, what was your approach to that then, Derek?
It evolved more and more. Take a backward step a little bit. I came from a shop floor background. And that shop floor background put me in good stead for when I took over management roles. I had an understanding of some of the frustrations the workforce might have. And it was quite handy, so you could look at a shop floor perspective as well as a management perspective. So it gave me a more rounded view on gaps in the system.
Where the potential issues were then.
Yeah, correct. And certainly also, I suppose, over probably a 10-year period, we looked at and put in place ISO 9001, ISO 14001, the Investors in People standard. We looked at social impacts. We also looked at Kaizen, which is a Japanese method for working. So that was very good as well.
So can I just ask on that then, in terms of ISO 14001, that was the first time that you were implementing that, was it? And did you go on a course to learn about that, or were you self-taught? Was that something that you did? Because I know that not many businesses in the early 90s had 14001. How did you go about
it was a mixture
that?
of both. But a lot of it was experience, and in fact we used a consultancy to help us and guide us in a certain direction, because there's no doubt about it, there is ISO speak, and it's not always understood by shop floor, for instance, not always understood by middle management, and quite often not understood by the directors of the company. So having that more rounded view of things, it helped. But language is very important, because you needed to explain in, say, shop floor language, in middle management language, in director language, let's say, in terms of what we were trying to do and trying to achieve.
And what would you say was the biggest challenge for the organisation when introducing not just an environmental management system, but a new system, new ways of working? What were the main challenges and how did you overcome those?
Well, in some ways, ISO didn't work, which meant that we needed to look at more lean manufacturing sort of options like Kaizen, and then bring that back to, well, what did ISO say? We've looked at this mixture of things, and we looked at and worked with lots of outside bodies, universities we work with. We work with students. We'd have students come in and do research work for us. So that was handy in itself. And then we gradually developed a wider view, taking on societal sort of needs. We work with the councils, we work with our clients, we work with the local businesses. In fact, we were a best practice company. We'd invite other businesses to come in and see our best practice, and also, in fact, criticise, what they thought wasn't so good. And that was quite handy.
Yeah, very interesting. So it sounds as though the key theme there is engagement with all interested parties.
Correct.
That play a part then, so that I guess helped to overcome any resistance or challenges.
Yeah.
But it's understanding the needs of all those interested parties, was it?
Yeah, I mean, that programme was called the Inside UK Best Practice Programme, and as I say, we invited similar companies. There might have been other printing companies, but different companies from different walks of life.
So not just in the print industry?
No, and we could then explain our ISO method, explain our Kaizen method, explain our not only managerial methods, but take them on a tour of the factory floor, and they could talk with staff quite openly and honestly.
Brilliant. So it sounds as though the employees were all empowered to take responsibility for the system. It was
Correct.
their system.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, so then our visitors got a better understanding that we were quite an open company. And in fact, we appeared on various radio programmes, television programmes. I think we were on BBC Newsnight one time. So. But gradually we evolved into this, or looking at the whole ethos of sustainability and what it meant. In the early, I suppose, 2000s, late 90s maybe, got involved with a thing called the Sigma Guidelines, which was developed by BSI, Forum for the Future.
Can you just explain what that actually was then, Derek?
And the Institute for Accountability. And that was like asking organisations, various organisations from different walks of life, what sustainability meant to them. And it was a 3-year programme. So we had the likes of British Airways, TNT, Walthamstow Council, Northumbrian Water, quite varied companies, all practising and looking at the sustainability within their own organisation. Marks and Spencer's Plan A was developed in that arena. So we all brought different levels of expertise to the table to try and hammer out a way of looking at sustainability and a way of implementing measures within our respective organisations. So we're learning all the time from company to company.
So tell me about that learning experience then. So obviously you've achieved a lot already within the organisation, and in some ways well ahead of your time as far as the print industry was concerned then. But you mentioned about learning and learning from others. So what additional learning did you gain from this Sigma approach and programme that you're on that you could then apply back into the workplace?
Well, it was quite interesting really, because predominantly they were large companies, the companies I've just spoken about, and many others actually. And you've got this difference between big company ethos and small company, you know, and the restrictions on small companies. And we were a company of around 50 at the time, but we dealt with some pretty big clients. We were a 24-hour operation, so obviously the advertising agencies are very controlled in what they want, what they require in terms of what I haven't explained, billboard posters, bus advertising, and so on. We had to really look at how we could implement measures for controlling that process. So in some ways we were talking the same language as the bigger companies, in other ways bigger companies were inquiring how a small company operated. That led to other visits. I mean, we had visits from a big company in Japan called Dai Nippon, who came around and looked at our best practice. And being Japanese, their culture is very much cyclical, and they're looking at the family, let's say, even within a big organisational context, let's say.
Could you just expand on that? You mentioned the family.
Yeah.
Could you just explain that in further detail, Derek?
Well, I think as far as I understand Japanese culture, they are very hard-edged in terms of business, but very close-knit, let's say. They take their family values into their business values.
Right, okay, so very much working in collaboration as one unit. Yeah.
And that is interesting in itself, because when you look at concepts like Plan, Do, Check, Act out of the ISO 9000 standard and developed by Deming, he took those ideas, Western culture, into Japanese culture. So again, that's cyclical in its outlook, but most, I suppose, British and European businesses run in a linear way. So plan, start from A, get to the finish, what's the output? Whereas Japanese and various Asian companies, so Asian views are very cyclical.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a whole interesting debate as well.
Great. And I know that you've achieved many things in your career, and I'll never forget the day when I interviewed you. So obviously it's a while ago now.
Yeah.
And I didn't have an office at the time, either did I.
No.
That was Blackmores' beginnings. And so I came over to your house, didn't I? And I can remember sitting down in an armchair with you and having a cup of tea. And I spotted a picture of you and the Queen. And I mentioned to you, I said, "Is that you, Derek, over there?" He said, "Yes." And I said, "Oh, how did that come about?" And I can remember you saying very clearly, as though it was yesterday, "Well, Melanie, I had this eureka moment." And from then on, I was captivated, and I was a huge fan of Derek Hall. And so can you just share with our listeners about that experience and that journey and how you were awarded an MBE by the Queen?
Okay, well, going back to my involvement with sustainability, etc., Sigma guidelines, at the same sort of time I was trying to develop a method of sustainability for the printing company I'm talking about, a company called Bovens Limited. And I came up with an idea of our tree of sustainability, because the tree relating to the print industry and the paper suppliers of that industry. So we evolved this idea of a tree of sustainability. Now this tree had 9 branches for improvement. And the 9 branches were areas like waste, energy, people and learning, very much the social sort of side, and business and society. So there were environmental branches, but also wider societal branches. And what we tried to do is then measure that system each year. So we joined a thing called EMAS, which was very much like ISO 14001, but it was more that you needed to report on your environmental impact. So we actually then used that tree of sustainability as a measurement point. So we looked at how well we were performing. And bear in mind that that tree also was vetted by the Environment Agency and the local council. So it had to be real sort of facts. In turn, it became part of our management system. In turn, we were auditing against that system. In turn, when we had other visitors see our methods, we explained that system. And a lot of work then carried on for many years using that method. But knowing that it was a eureka moment, as you might say, but then again, it had to have some hard edges to it. It had hard measurement points to it.
But it was almost like there was, correct me if I'm wrong, but almost like an enlightenment that, right, this is what we're doing within the organisation, but you could see almost like a pattern really there of all the different strands that go into running a successful business in a sustainable way, not just based on a quality standard, not just based on an environmental standard.
No.
Or any other techniques. And I know that obviously that covers health and safety as well, so there was a risk management angle. But I think that back then, many businesses just had a quality manual, or if they were to introduce another standard, it would be a separate manual, and it was almost divorced. It was separated from the business. Yeah. Whereas I think, from my understanding, the sustainable tree brought all of those aspects together. Is that? That's
correct. I mean, and also going back to language, when I was looking at, say, waste, for instance, I'm down on the print floor with the print operators. I'm saying, how much waste do you get? So that waste then, if you had asked me for 100 posters, I would have to print maybe 150 posters. Why? Because we had to go through the machine, say, 4 times for 4 different colours. And then you'd have wastage off of that. So how many overs or extras do you put into a print run? So then, guess what? Talk to the managing director. That's a cost. That's costing you money. And also, to dispose of it, it's also costing you money. So how can we minimise that ratio down? And how can we improve maybe the inks we use? So instead of using solvent-based inks, we could use ultraviolet ink. So there were a lot of different factors that came in. But as I said earlier, it meant something to the workforce, but it meant something to management, and certainly something to directors. So.
Is that because you could also see a reduction on the bottom line? So it did help in terms of profitability because you were operating more efficiently?
Correct, correct. And also you identified where it wasn't so efficient. So another example was energy saving. Most print dryers are heat dried, but to dry that, there's a cost obviously because you're using a lot of energy. How we can reduce our printing impacts? Well, ultraviolet ink. But if we use ultraviolet ink, they're dried or cured with high-powered lamps. So then that's an increase in energy. So then can we talk to the engineer and say, can we run a machine with 1 lamp instead of 2? So then, you're countering one thing against another. So you've got more friendly inks, you've got less wastage, and maybe you leveled the amount of energy going out the buildings. Because each of those branches virtually worked in competition with one another. So all the time, and then it came back to how well are you performing, etc., etc. So I think, for instance, I'll give you one example. Over a 4-year period, we saved £181,000 in turnover.
Excellent. Yeah, that's fantastic. So not only are the directors happy because they're saving money, workforce is happy because they feel as though they're making a contribution, hopefully, to a more sustainable environment. But also your clients are happy, ideally, as well. Happy. But then that led the company to go on to win various awards, didn't it? In recognition of how differently you were operating the business and how that was being successful.
Yeah, well, again, going back to the early 2000s, we won, in fact, 99 and the year 2000, we won the Best Small Business at the ACCA Awards, the Accountancy Awards in London, through these methods that we were putting in place. And various other awards, not only environmental awards, but also quality awards, certainly social awards we won over a good period of time. And while this was happening, we looked at the Queen's Award for Sustainable Development. So we managed to win that. And through this sort of best practice, that's probably how I achieved the MBE that you spoke about earlier on.
Yeah, which is fantastic that you for all those years of service and contribution to making businesses more sustainable, that you actually got that award. So, yeah, fantastic. What was it like meeting the Queen, by the way, Derek? I know I asked you this many years ago.
Well, I've met the Queen actually twice. Once at the Sustainability Awards, where, along with other businesses, we were introduced to the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh and Duke of Kent, I think, at the time, Princess Anne. That was really some experience because you're in a sort of smallish room, but you're in Buckingham Palace, but you're being introduced to various royalty and other people, and it was very interesting and on how the whole system, let's say, the monarchy operates. And it's very friendly. You weren't
doing a gap analysis on them, were you?
No, it's very friendly and very low-key, actually. Yeah, it was very good.
Excellent.
And then in terms of meeting the Queen on the MBE, that was myself with, to be exact, on the day, 99 other people received awards. Exactly 100 received awards on that day. And from all walks of life, fire service, soldiers fighting in the Iraq War, to name drop Roger Daltrey from the Who, somebody from the prison service, if I remember rightly, the Environment Agency.
So you were all sorts of interesting people.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, wonderful. Thanks very much for sharing your experience with us, Derek. And that then led on to the next decade of your life, which was implementing ISO standards with Blackmores. So that's where we'll wrap up for now, because on the next 2 episodes, we're going to be looking at how to implement ISO 14001, the Environmental Management Standard, where you'll be providing hints and tips for our listeners on that journey on how to implement an environmental management system. So thanks very much for sharing your background and experience with us today, Derek, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode.
My pleasure.
We look forward to catching up with our listeners then on the next ISO show.